Hey guys, how's your week going so far? Looks like there's about six of us. I'll just wait a bit longer. Hey Aria, how you been?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good week last week.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. All right. I might get started. It's just after 2. And a little bit down on numbers, but I also hear there's a problem with the Telstra NBN network actually. Are any of you guys on Telstra that you know of? You are, Jane. No problems, not slow.
No, no issues today.
Okay, yeah, I know people in Carlton who said that there's something wrong with it, but alrighty. Okay, so this is the week 5 of our lecture, week 5 of the course, and today's sort of theme is how to sort of break the cycle. So far we've looked at people and problems. We've started looking at problem cycles and problem loops, and I'm going to look at that a bit further and deliver the happy news that actually there's only 7 kind of problems in the world. At least there's only 7 kind of really big persistent problems. So no matter how complicated it seems these things are, there's actually only about 7 of them. Then we've got a guest from Dr. Darren Sharp, and he is a Monash researcher, and his particular area of research is exactly what we're interested in, which is transitions or large changes. And he's also in social innovation. So he'll talk to us about social innovation theory and he'll talk about his work and the work of sort of managing or creating large scale change. So he'll be on from about kind of 2:30. And then after that, I'm going to talk about breaking the loops. So I'm going to talk about how when we use a tool like Loopy, which is a very simple tool, its real purpose isn't to solve the problem that we model, but it is to give us something to look at and talk about and use for educating others. And then finally, towards the end of the day, I'd like to look at the business of trying to pair up entrepreneurs with problems. And I'll also introduce the importance of a narrative. So there'll be any solution to any problem has some kind of story or narrative, and I'm just going to introduce that as one of our tools. All right. And like I always do at the beginning of these sessions, I want to point out what it is that we're trying to solve or what we're trying to do. And the biggest opportunity for us is when there's a problem. It's easy to get the system to change if it's under stress or there's some kind of challenge or problem. And so these 3 strands here are called Kingdon's 3 streams. And Kingdon was the guy who invented the whole concept of the social or policy entrepreneur. So there's plenty of books he's written about the role of entrepreneurs in the creation of the government solutions. This all started in about 1980. And so here's his 3 streams. And whenever there's a problem, a great way to solve it is something has to change. So there has to be some kind of innovation of some sort. And down the bottom there, the black politics ribbon, this is the people, right? Because it's the people that manage politics and interact and teach each other what to do and solve problems. And so this is where the entrepreneurs are needed, in the politics stream. This thing Kingdon calls the policy window. This is when to act. So there may have been a long-running problem for a real long time. And there may have been a lot of politics, a lot of people arguing about it. But something happens and creates this kind of crunch point for a pretty short time. And so it's in this policy window that the policy entrepreneurs pop up and use their tools and their connections and make something happen. And then what comes out of the policy window, as I've shown at the right, are the solutions. And the solutions usually always involve some kind of government program or policy. And policies run through everything. And when they pass through the policy window, they get changed or squished or started or stopped. But what pops out the other end as a solution to this situation is going to be some kind of government policy. So this is the really high level view of the opportunity, the window, and then the relationship between the problems and the people who solve them. And so what we've done so far leading up to this is that we've taken another good look at problem cases, and you went off and got some. Then I showed you some basic tools to help diagram or illustrate problems. This is the beginning of sort of pulling them to bits, classifying them. And so you've used those and you've created submissions on Moodle. And then at the same time, your submissions to the entrepreneur form, which is really the same process again, but for people, was it these forms are attempting to get to the bottom of what the social entrepreneur is and what makes them. So now we've got people and problems. And what I'd like to do now is move on to this concept of attempting to align them. So attempting to find the right people for the problems that we have. And so I went and checked out Moodle and Mural, and I've seen that just about everybody has submitted 2 problems along with diagrams. I think I looked about an hour ago, there was just 2 more teams that were yet to put their problems and diagrams up there. And I've got a request from one team if they can please have a little bit more time. But apart from that, 2 teams to go. There's 15 people have put their diagrams up there, which is just great. And so what I'd like to do now is just go over some of these. I can see some arrows flying around as I speak. But what I'd like to do is ask some of you to explain what you found and talk us through your breakdown of the problem that you dug up. So who would like to go first, or shall I just snipe? What about you, Noah? Who's your partner?
Yeah, my partner is Georgia.
Okay. Do you guys want to show us one of yours?
Sure. Should I share the screen, or should we just look at the mural?
Please share the screen.
Okay.
All right.
Right. So I'll just talk about mine first. So I sort of look into discriminatory policy and planning facilitate environment injustice. So basically looking into how the community of color and poor community are more likely to expose to pollution, and they would not consult most of the time when health hazard facility are being placed on their neighborhood. And also because the leadership are predominantly middle class and white, which control the allocation of environment costs and benefit. So in terms of costs, I was putting it at discrimination, and yeah, system would be class and race system, social division and gender system. Actors is slum occupants, urban developers, and the government agency. Some fixes that was failed is there's one example to look at the attempt to fix the pollution issue, which impose the energy transition on the rural population. So lands are being used to grow bioenergy crops instead of being used to grow food. So that wasn't the local food security and increased the incentive for land grab. I also make a little diagram here to explain how they all connected. And I try around with the loopy, but it was quite confusing for me. And Georgia can speak about her net zero building.
Okay. Just before you go, Georgia, do you want to pull that back up again? Sorry, Noah.
Yeah, sorry. Yes.
All right. So the problem is that there's pollution. There's a pollution problem,
Yeah.
primarily, and it's not getting solved. And it's not getting solved because of inequality. Yeah. So it seems like if you've got one bad problem, which is pollution, which might be one difficult problem to solve, but it's kind of getting solved unevenly.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just looking at your societal system. So you've got the UNFCCC, and you've got urban planners and local agencies, right? So local agencies, you mean like the local government or?
The people that live within that area. So people like community of colors or the people that live in the slum.
Okay. So those are like the occupants or the,
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And you said you had to go with Loopy. How did you go? What was your thinking?
Yeah, so I tried to diagram the elite decision making that contribute to the unjust environment location, and if it was a local decision making, then it would lessen the unjust injustice that happening, but then it would also bring more local into the decision making process. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good effort. Loopy has a couple of limitations, and one of them is obviously the labels that you can put on those balls.
Yeah.
But most of these kind of problems, so we've got a problem, and they're trying to fix it, but they're not doing a very good job, and they have decided that maybe they can fix pollution for middle class people, but they're not going to fix pollution in the poorer areas. And this is actually a stuck problem called shifting goals. So you start off in the beginning saying, you know what, let's solve this for everybody. Let's solve pollution for everybody. And then due to constraints, the goal starts to drop, right? And so the target of all the effort starts to exclude people due to inequality. And a little while later, I'll show you a loopy diagram for this. And there could be other ways to explain it, but the trick is to pick a diagram that is the sort of simplest one that you can point to and say, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. And then if you can run it and it behaves itself, well, all the better. But you want a diagram where you can use it to convince me of what you see as the problem. And then you're able to say, see how it goes around, like see how the arrows, we're never getting out of this, right? This is why it's a circular problem. All right. And Georgia, do you want to switch over and check out yours?
Yep, one sec. Is that on?
Yep.
So I called mine economic dilemma with net zero buildings.
and I've focused it on Australia. So I've just written as a landscape, the Australian economy is heavily dependent on fossil fuel industry. One part of achieving a net zero building is by using renewable energy rather than fossil. The government has the power to implement minimum requirement legislation and or incentives to make this change. However, it goes against their own interests and their economic benefit. Without the change in legislation, most home builders and owners may not see the value in investing in sustainable design because it's not a law. So, I mean, I know it's coming into law now, but I was talking about why it's not currently the majority of houses. Yeah, the cause is kind of just the same thing. The systems, I've just put government policy and low to middle income earners. The actors are policymakers, builders, home buyers, and I guess, yeah, sustainability.
Okay, because the the landscape is the sort of, it's like the chessboard, if you like, and also the historic thing. So you would, if you had just met someone who didn't know anything about Australia, you would explain to them that it's a country that's a mining country. 65% of all of our money is from mining. And so fossil fuels are mined here and manufactured, or mined and refined. So they're very established and very powerful people, and they have power over the market, and they have power over everything. And so then you can just say, well, even though we've got governments here, and Australia is a democracy, even then the government has always had to listen to, it doesn't matter whether it's Liberal or Labor, you've got to listen to the fossil fuel players. So that's the landscape. The cause is the fact that the government just can't seem to stop doing this. Like, they are hooked on fossil fuels, or perhaps it's corruption. So but we don't know, you see. So remember, with your diagram here, you've got the surface. It's okay in this game not to be able to put your finger exactly on what the cause is. In fact, if you've got a problem and you can just put your finger right on the cause, then either you're wrong or it's not a very serious problem. Right. So persistent problems, this is a 100-year-old problem for Australia, this one. And we look at the societal systems under the dotted line. So we know that the energy providers, so the societal systems would be the energy system. So not energy consumption, that's an activity. And you've pointed out lower to middle income earners here. That's a kind of a group of people. It's not really a system, but it's like just a group, a class of people. And over on the left, you've got government policy. Again, the system is the government. So the government department, perhaps it's a Department of Energy or the Department of Environment. The societal systems are these little groups of people that all think they're working on something. So the energy department or the energy industry is a group of people that are in roles serving that industry. That's what a societal system is.
Got it.
Okay. All right.
And then my loopy.
All right.
Okay. So I first had these 4, which is kind of what I already explained. And then I just thought I'd have a bit of fun with it and chuck in like activists. And it still worked because with loopy, like the longer the line is, the slower that event like happens. So because this loop is quite long, even though there's a lot of activists, it takes a while for them to actually have any input into any legislation. So then it gets cancelled out by these 2 anyway.
Okay.
But yeah, that's basically that one.
All right. So the problem, as you've designed it, it's a tight loop, right? So you've got a tight relationship here between the fossil fuel industry, environmental activists, and net zero homes. And then something goes the other way, and there's economic benefit from the fossil fuel industry, that's cancelled out by net zero legislation, which supports net zero homes. So I can sort of see that it's a loop going this way and that way. The smallest loop I can see in here is the one that goes fossil fuel industry, economic benefit, net zero legislation, net zero homes. So that's
like the core one, and then I just added the other one on.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I wanted everybody to play with Loopy. It's super fun. And I'll make one comment to you, which I'll explain again with an example shortly. Loopy doesn't have delays. So a lot of complicated systems, things start out pretty good. And then after a while, problems start to heap up, but they don't heap up immediately. So there's this concept of the model having a delay. And George has hacked it by having a long loop.
It said that in the instructions. I don't know.
Good. And I hack it by putting some extra balls in that don't do anything. So great. Okay. And right. So in this case, I can't immediately pick what the problem is, but as we go on and I explain to you these classic kinds, perhaps we can pick which one of the classic kinds each of these problems is. Alrighty. SG, do you want to, have you done yours yet?
Yeah, it's up there.
All right. Do you want to show us, do you want to pull up the screen?
So the one I worked on, it was based on consumption and the effect that it has on environmental pollution. Oh, can you see that? Is that too blurry? That's all I can zoom in. But
I can see the text above it, so I can read name, but I can't quite see the loopy diagram. But go on anyway.
Okay, sorry. So I did consumption, and then it went on to electrical demands and how policies and then development needed for policies, because I wanted to link how an individual consumption, like consumerism in a household, infrastructure consumption, and like government work. I feel like it's a loop that can't be fixed pretty much because we're all together. So when I started to do the loop, it was like I couldn't find a resolution for it or like a solution.
All right, hold it right there. Hold it just there for a second, and just tell us a bit more about the problem so that we can think about the model a bit more.
The problem is that us individuals or like investors or infrastructure government, we're consuming too much in general, like demanding too much than what we need. This is either that we're wanting to make our living standards better, or it's that it's the market of the living life cycle is like that. Then when I did some research, I found like the industrial GPD is like a big aspect of this for nations. So that's why I put government in there. And it's like so it starts off with like the private sector, which has an effect on an individual's lifestyle, like employment. And the private sector is kind of feeding off from the government, because the government is actually also making money by migration or by more infrastructure built in the society. I hope that makes sense, but that's what I was trying to aim. So like it's a simple solution problem, like a consumerism, but then there's actually stuff behind it. That's effective. Okay.
So in some ways, you've picked one that's so huge.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So you're gonna always be able to find something in this that to sort of look at. But I'll just comment on the landscape. So it's like I said before to Noah and Georgia, that the landscape is explaining this problem as if someone just landed here from Mars and they don't know what consumption is, or they don't know about this problem. And so the landscape is your quick kind of summary of how this started off or how it came about and what the kind of major components of this problem are, or what the chain of events is that's put all this stuff here today, that's created today's problem. And so you've got here the desire to increase standards. I think are you thinking of the standard of living or what?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So people want a higher standard of living.
Yeah.
And so they consume, but then their consumption creates pollution.
Correct.
Right. But you could have picked, you could have said, you know, we buy things to make us feel better, mental health, or we buy things to show off to our friends status, or we buy things because we just are in the habit of doing that. We don't, it's entertainment, right? So there's a number of kind of landscape things that could have made this problem so bad. And when you look at the landscape, it also helps you kind of hone in a bit on the part of the problem that you're interested in. Because as you said here, consumption is huge, it's everything. So the landscape might help you pick the bits you like the most. So, okay, and you've got here, yep. So the cause, a long-term pattern of overconsumption of human activities during economic growth, which worsens climate breakdown and increases air pollution. Okay, so again, the causes might, we can be vague about the causes of this. And this isn't the cause that started in the 17th century. This is the cause that's with us today, keeping this thing going, keeping the problem stuck. And the cause could be, you know, mental health, status, perhaps, you know, what some of these vague things, or the advertising industry, we just don't know. But we know that something's going on, otherwise we'd just stop consuming, right?
Yes.
Okay, so all right. Now show us your diagrams. So you've got a big loopy. And
A big loopy.
I can't quite see that. I can probably go.
Do you want me to request to share a mural? Would that be easier?
I don't actually know how that works. So
okay.
I'm looking at Moodle myself. Maybe other people can too. All right. I can see lots of pointers flying around on Moodle. Okay, there it is. Right. All right. Yeah, it looks like it's, is it like a PDF or something, or, oh no, I can see it. Yeah. All right. So if you move your mouse onto that, we should be able to see it, right? Yeah. I see Sophia. All right, so what would you like to do, SG, to share this?
I'll request to be followed on Mural if you like.
Okay, and then what do I do?
You just...
Okay, all right, I see it. Okay.
All right, I'm in the NBN area, so like that's why my internet's slow. Maybe that's why.
And is everybody else okay to do follow and see what SG is doing? Let us know if you can't see this or hear it.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Okay, go for it.
So, so with the ecosystem one, I did private commercial politicians as actors. And then I did the system is the trade of like a nation. So the trade and net exports, investors, government, and yeah, that's it. And then from above, like to the symptoms, I branched out how they're all kind of linked somehow one another. So high employment rate, demands for increasing living standards. And then that is also connected with the investors because like they can't put money into it, so they need like a return.
Yep.
Exports increase to the government and for the investors. And for the government, I did how more human migration and more infrastructure.
Okay.
Of this.
All right. Okay. Okay, that's cool. What I'll do with all these great diagrams is I might feed back to you and give you an opportunity just to tweak them a bit, because some of the diagrams you're very close, but not quite there. So I'm keen that like investors is a kind of societal system, at least a large investment bank would be a societal system. The government is a system, but usually it's part of that. So usually if you're talking about consumption, or you're talking about the advertising industry or something, there's a government department for that. And the actors are the people we're trying to push the finger at. So the actors are the people we can try and point to that are probably involved, right?
Yeah, because it was like, I thought like when I was doing it, it's kind of all broad, like it's everyone pretty much. So I didn't know like which one to actually pinpoint at.
All right.
So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So I'm just going to check and see if Darren is with us. Just a minute. He's coming on a bit early because you can only do 2:30 to 3:30. Just bear with me for a second. Okay. No, he's not here yet. Okay. All right. Well, no matter. There's plenty of great work to look at. So I'm going to go back to Mural myself, and I'm going to zoom out. And I'm going to pick one more team. Okay, how about Ria and Cindy? Do you guys want to take us for a tour?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll share my screen.
All right.
So the problem that I looked at is like due to rapid urban growth, it is kind of neglecting what actually residents want and desire the space to be. So for landscape, I have chosen rapid urbanization, broader socio-economic trends, and then there are few deficiencies in modern planning. And there are some spaces which are created which are not used by the public usually, and then which loses sort of the culture and cultural and local identity of the space, and overall causes mental and physical illness as well. So the cause for this was to develop better infrastructure and to cope up with the global trend of modernizations. Most of the governments have opted for this solution, as in for the modernist approach for planning, and this is mostly happening in developing countries. So the actors that I've looked at is local council, architects and planners, designers, investors, and the residents itself. And the fixes that failed so far, in order to just fix this, maybe there could be laws which include people understanding, or people actually locals to understand the needs and requirements, and to have some proactive integrated urban planning and design approach to incorporate with the future visions for the cities, and the clear understanding of the space that could actually affect the factors and the use of urban space. And again, yeah, formulation of guidelines, and that's a repeated one. And for societal diagrams, so this is it. So the actors are local council, urban planners and architects, the investors, and the local people. The societal systems, government, the building and construction industry, and the community. And the problem that is happening because of rapid urbanization and economic growth is happening because of poor designing skills, some unused and disguised spaces, which is affecting physical and mental health, and as well as there are loss of culture and values.
Okay, before you explain the loopy diagram, usually when there's a community involved, which community would it be? So it's not the community of all possible people. You know what I mean? It's there's usually some slice of the community that's most affected by the problem.
So I was referring to, like, suppose it's happening in a particular area, that it could be the locals or the residents of that particular area.
Okay, so it would be the local community. It would be the community of South Melbourne or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And your actors, again, your actors are the people who have the sort of the power to do something, or the power to intervene. The societal systems are the groups of people who must be involved somehow. And the actors are people that are likely to be responsible. So it's more, this diagram is more about breaking down the problem and the problematic parts of the problem. So trying to help us see or try and pick apart the problem. The local people being harmed, they're the sort of the victims of the problem, if you like. And so just quickly show us your loopy diagram, and then I'll introduce Darren.
Yep.
Sorry, Darren, if you can hear us, just give us a sec.
So what my loopy diagram explains is like if there's economic growth, there would be urbanization, there would be more roads and buildings built.
Mm-hmm.
And if the places are well planned in the interest of the public, then there would be less despised spaces, and it could maybe enhance local businesses, enhance cultural and local social values.
Yep.
Would reduce mental and physical illness, and overall it will be a prosperous community and the city, and which would again result in the economic growth.
Okay, it's good, and I see how it works, and it sort of it fits a narrative of what I would call the solution to the problem. But it's good to be able to diagram what the problem is and why the problem is stuck. So I'll feed back to you on these diagrams, and I might tweak it a bit just to sort of show the basic sort of loop that's stuck, if you like. Okay, so I'm gonna just reach out to Darren. Darren, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, hi. Hi,
everyone.
Nice to be with you today.
All right, so just give me a second and I'll just get back the screen, and I'll just introduce Darren. All right, just a minute. Okay, so I'm just going over some built environment problems, and I'll just skip over what we have here. So I've got Darren coming, and I'll explain all this stuff to you shortly. So Darren, we're very lucky to have Darren on board. As I said, he works at Monash with me. He doesn't work with me, but he's an established researcher there. And he's of particular interest to our team, our group, because of his work in transitions. So I've introduced several concepts in transitions, and we are looking a bit at transitions theory and a bit at complexity theory and systems thinking, but also we're most interested in innovations and how innovations can be given to the government or used and expanded by the government for the benefit of everybody. And so, Darren, if you want to add anything to this, I just tried to pick out the pretty simple introduction.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've got my slides, which I can start sharing now, Craig, and I can go through a bit of my background and research interests. And just before we kick off, just to confirm, if I talk for about 45 minutes, is that okay? And then 15, 20 minutes of questions afterwards? Is that about an hour? Is that what we're aiming for?
Yep, that's super. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, well, that's great. So it's, firstly, thanks so much, Craig, for the introduction, for the welcome and for the introduction, for inviting me to be here with you all today. I'm looking forward to sharing some more details about my work, and then to open up for a broader discussion with you all. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, go into presenter mode. So yeah, as you mentioned, Craig, so I've been at Monash for coming up to 3 years now, and I work at the Sustainable Development Institute, which is sort of based at the Clayton campus. We've got an office in the city as well. We're quite a large institute, probably over 100, I think it's 160 people now, which is pretty large. We've got a number of business units. I'm in the research team. There's a group which works with us, which is part of us, called Climate Works Australia, which you may have heard of, which do more sort of policy focused work, and they are based in the city, and they tend to work very closely with industry and government clients. So they're more of a sort of consulting sort of think tank type of outfit. Similarly, there's Behaviour Works, which is another big group within the MSDI. They do a lot of consulting work with industry and government as well, and research on behaviour change programs. So my research, though, specifically is looking at urban sustainability transitions. So we have an emerging area of research which is interdisciplinary. It's looking at how do we shift urban systems towards sustainability. I'm particularly interested in using process-based approaches like living labs, which I'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about today. Living labs bring a variety of different stakeholders together to essentially experiment with a whole bunch of socio-technical innovations, as it were. So university actors, industry, government partners, local residents, members of local communities, and so on, to come up with, in many cases, radical experiments to try and push the needle closer towards sustainable outcomes. And I have an interest also in grassroots innovations, where you've got, more bottom-up activities happening, which are community-led and often supported by local government and other actors who try and amplify those activities. And I'll give you lots of examples and case studies, and I'll be drawing on my current project, which is Net Zero Precincts, which is an ARC linkage grant that we won, which is about to commence. It's a 4-year research project. And I'll also be looking at case studies from my doctoral research, which I did a number of years ago, which is bringing together a lot of these themes and topics. And primarily going to focus today on urban sustainability transitions, experimentation, and living labs, and then open up a conversation with all of you here to hear where you're at and how you respond to all this, and what is most pressing in terms of your minds at the moment, and your work and your focus and so on. So just to kind of set the scene, I suppose, we'd probably have to be sort of, I guess, living under a rock to not notice the litany of bad news that we keep hearing about, the sort of, not just the climate, but the sort of global situation environmentally. I suppose the most recent IPCC report came out last week, which was pretty depressing news. We know that we need to reduce or limit our warming to under 2 degrees Celsius to have any hope of having a sort of safe climate this century. So we've got a kind of very limited carbon budget left in terms of how much carbon we can emit into the atmosphere, which we're currently treating as a bit of a global dumping ground, a bit of a rubbish tip, with very little penalties for just pumping out enormous amounts of CO2. We know that work from the Stockholm Resilience Centre tells us that we've now crossed 4 out of 9 planetary boundaries related to climate change, genetic diversity, land system change, chemical flows, and there's an enormous extinction crisis underway at the moment, with a variety of species either becoming extinct or becoming endangered, and so on. So I don't want to dwell on this, but just to set the scene, that there's a lot of what we would describe as persistent problems of unsustainability, which should be front of mind, and not hopefully not keeping us awake at night. I'm sure it does for many of us, but there's a whole bunch of people. I guess the good news is there's a whole bunch of people around the world looking at how do we transition from this present state of unsustainability towards sustainability. So transitions research, which is the field that I'm situated in, has been around for about 20 years or so now. It sort of comes out of a number of different disciplinary areas: science and technology studies, complexity theory, innovation studies, ecological economics. There's a whole bunch of different disciplines and sub-disciplines, but it's been coalescing over the last couple of decades now, sort of primarily centering initially out of work in Europe, but it's become really a global research paradigm with many journals publishing articles in this field and so on. And, you know, annual conferences happening all the time. And, you know, researchers around Australia, there's many researchers doing this sort of work to understand the nature of transitions. And I guess what we mean when we talk about transitions, I guess picking up on a word that Craig referred to earlier in terms of like systems kind of thinking, and it's really about that systems kind of level approach that we can bring to this. So I guess when we're talking about transitions, we're talking about these fundamental changes in culture, in structure, and in practices. So when we talk about culture, it could be everything from the, you know, the narratives we use, the visions we have, you know, about what it means to live a good life, about livelihoods, about, you know, livability, if we're talking about urban environments, you know, amenity and all these sorts of things. So the visions, the shared beliefs, the paradigms that we have, values and perspectives. Then at a structural level, there's all the complex institutional arrangements that we have, you know, between, you know, local, state and federal government, institutional arrangements between different, you know, economic actors, between different NGO and community sector actors and others. Then all the kind of different, you know, rules that are around our regulatory environment and so on. So there's a whole bunch of different, you know, structuration processes are at work there too. And then at a level of our daily lives, there's practices that we kind of take for granted in terms of, you know, how we eat and move and get around and shop and consume and live our lives, and, you know, the actions that we take as individuals and as a society collectively. So together, it's, you know, we can understand that transitions are really about trying to move these cultures, structures and practices at a systems kind of level to, as I said earlier, move from unsustainability towards sustainability. And these are long-term shifts. So when we're talking about transitions, they're often understood as large-scale reconfigurations of what we call socio-technical systems, and I'll spend a bit of time talking about what that means. And these often occur over decades, in the vicinity of sort of like 25 to 50 years. And so, you know, we can see that that's very much happening at the moment now in terms of our energy systems moving from, you know, fossil fuel system to renewable systems. And it's been underway now for at least a couple of decades, and it's probably got another couple of decades to go. And it doesn't happen, you know, quickly, but they're often when things are built up and there's momentum that gathers pace, things can move radically in a direction very, very suddenly. So I mentioned that term socio-technical system. And so I guess this is like a broader discussion of that. So what we generally see as sectors can also be defined as socio-technical systems. And I've given an example here in terms of road transportation, which if you think about it, if you step back and look at it, you can see that in terms of road transportation, there are various actors, which could be firms and individuals, there are institutions, there are behavioural norms, standards of practice, there are a whole bunch of material artefacts, which, you know, we could point to as all the infrastructure that we kind of see in our cities, and there's knowledge systems as well. So we understand socio-technical systems as this co-evolution of technology and social systems. And the essential idea is that these interlinkages across complex systems, they tend to lock us in, they tend to lock society into particular ways of meeting our needs. So they incentivize incremental improvements to establish technologies rather than more radical or fundamental changes that are required. And so this raises a bunch of questions, including if the lock-ins to establish systems are so profound, how can we achieve fundamental systemic change? I mean, if you think about the move to electric vehicles, for example, you can, you know, on a very obvious level, we can look at the politics around that, where there was sort of like, you know, a lot of talk during the last election about how electric vehicles are going to, you know, take away our weekends and all this kind of rubbish, and, you know, all the kind of the difficulties in transitioning something as seemingly simple as moving from a, you know, petrol engine to an electric vehicle, just in terms of the infrastructure. I mean, I was looking at buying another car recently, and, you know, it's actually quite hard to just plug your electric vehicle into the wall and charge it up. Often it takes overnight or longer, and then the range is still quite short, and you can't just go recharge your EV like you can go fill up your tank of petrol. So there's all these kind of path dependencies, that's a term that we use, and lock-ins that we don't kind of acknowledge, that we kind of are blind to day to day, but it's very expensive, very difficult politically, socially, on an infrastructural level to shift these systems which have been, around, in this case with the sort of petrol engine and the car, for about 100 years or so now. So in terms of understanding how transitions work and how they can be accelerated, I suppose, transitions researchers have developed a range of theories to explain how these socio-technical systems are structured, the ways that these systems can be reorganised to deliver more sustainable outcomes. And what you're seeing here is a graph of what's known as the multi-level perspective. And this essentially characterises these systems as operating around, at the top level there, you've got the landscape, and then the regime sort of level in the middle there, and then niches at the bottom. And so what's happening essentially, the way that, this is not a sort of prescriptive device, it's more like a way to analyse and understand how transitions can take place. And so what we're looking at here is, these systems are structured and stabilised, what we call a regime. These include, if we think back to energy or road transport and so on, these could be knowledge, investments, policies, institutions, skills, cultural values, and so on. And then we've got innovative technologies and practices, which are really seen as key to driving the systems change towards sustainability, but these often really struggle to have an impact because we've got businesses and consumers who are, as I mentioned earlier, locked into established ways of doing things, established modes of production and consumption. So for innovations to emerge and to alter these dominant systems, two things are needed. So one of those is niches. So these are protected spaces below the regime level where innovators can develop, nurture, and importantly experiment with new technologies, with new social practices. And they don't, to be able to do that, they need to do that without interference or, direct pressure from the regime itself. So we can think about all the innovation that's happening in terms of electric vehicles, all the innovations that are happening in terms of community energy, in terms of microgrids, in terms of batteries, and so on and so forth. A lot of this is happening at the niche level. There's a lot of experimentation that's going on. And then what happens is these niches try to essentially then take advantage of what's known as windows of opportunities to then push through these niches and alter the regimes. And then at a higher level, of a landscape level, you have mega trends such as demographic shifts, economic growth, demand for resources, and so on, which also places pressure on the regime. So you have pressure coming down from the top in terms of the broader structural changes which are happening globally, and then pressure coming up from the bottom, from the niches, and then hopefully you can push those innovations through, not just technological, but also those social innovations, to then try and alter those regimes and then bring through new socio-technical systems, and then eventually try and phase out unsustainable practices. So I know I've thrown a lot of theory at you, but this is kind of like important to kind of just set the scene in terms of the transitions kind of field. And I'm happy to kind of send more resources and readings and articles and things your way. So I won't spend too much longer going on about transitions research itself, but it's important to understand that it's not just about technical change, that it's about reconfiguring societal systems. So to do that, what's required is also really importantly visions to guide systemic innovation towards sustainability. So you're seeing this happening a lot in terms of the sort of areas I talked about, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of the shift towards net zero. There's a lot of talk at the moment about how do we get to net zero by the middle of the century. So these are visions, these are narratives of imagined futures that don't exist yet, that are trying to be compelling stories of the future, to drag people together, to bring us together, to move us towards a more sustainable kind of outcome. That also requires, really importantly, social and policy innovation. the phasing out of unsustainable practices, policy experimentation, which I talked about earlier, and then importantly, engaging a range of actors and stakeholders, and then enabling those actors and stakeholders to undertake those more radical types of innovations, which I previously alluded to as well.
Darren, I'll just ask a question.
Yeah.
It's great to get a view of the theory from this perspective, because we've kind of come at this transitions theory sideways. So we've come in basically problem driven. So we've come in looking at persistent problems and cyclic problems, and we just finished an exercise beginning to document the landscape of the problem, the features of the problem, the actors, and the societal systems in the problem. So we've got most of these components in our approach, but we've come in with a sort of a problem coming in this way, and then a social entrepreneur coming in this way,
right?
Whom I will inevitably try to stitch together, at least as an exercise to show how large scale change happens. So you're right on the ball, and we haven't covered the theory this way, the way that Gilles put it together in the multi-level system. We haven't looked at the whole picture, but it's great to see it.
No, that's really good. I mean, I think the way coming at it from, as you said, problems and actors is perfect to try and get a sense of how to wrap our heads around it, how to come up with practical solutions that can be tried and so on. And this is just sort of rounding it out with that kind of, broader kind of systemic kind of framing to understand just the complexity of it all, and just the different kind of, I suppose, moving parts to all this that's very, highly integrated and highly complex. So what I want to move into now is a discussion of, the urban. But before I do that, I wanted to maybe ask folks on the call now why they think it might be important to really focus on transitions at that urban scale. So please feel free to just chime in.
Any of you guys got a problem one of your problems you think might be relevant to this? At least at the urban. Well, I suppose you're interested in the urban scale, right, Darren?
Yeah. I mean, I can keep going, and then we can, maybe it'll trigger some more kind of thinking and responses as we go. But essentially, a lot of my work is looking at this at the level of cities, and at the moment, especially precincts, which is the focus of the net zero work that we're doing at Monash. So the reason being that a lot of these, changes are experienced locally, so we need to develop solutions at the local level too. And so you probably heard it said many times before that we're living in the urban century with, over half the world's population living in cities and urban settlements, and this is expected to get to about 3/4 by the middle of the century. So it's clear that it's fundamentally important to understand how socio-technical systems and transitions can happen at that urban scale, because most of humanity is living in those urban areas.
Yep, I think we're headed there. Like we're heading towards purely built environment problems. The first round of problems we've looked at have been quite a lot broader. So the general problem of overconsumption, the general problem of or problems of development and inequality, but we're coming down to a purely built environment. Everybody with us today is doing architecture, obviously, and we're trying to learn how to use our professional position as a position of influence. So how can we act as professionals and become social entrepreneurs for what we're probably going to be urban transitions?
Yeah, fantastic. No, that's perfect. So this sort of really brings us to a particular area of transitions research where I'm focused on, which is urban experimentation. So this is really an emerging field of practice and theory, which is, to your point, Craig, and it brings together academic, government, civil society and private sector actors to trial alternative city futures, multi-stakeholder governance approaches, grassroots innovations, new modes of sustainable development and urban planning, And it's clear that in recent years, the city has become an important site for experimentation, for testing new social practices, technologies, governance across a range of fields. So essentially what we're doing is we're using the city as a bit of a living lab, which I'll explain a bit further on, as a test site, a demonstration site to undertake co-creative collaboration in a real world kind of setting, to envision alternative solutions through place-based innovation, transition arenas and so on, and I'll give you some examples in the next few slides. So the reason why it's important at the scale of cities in the context of the climate emergency, the climate crisis and the sustainable development goals, I've already mentioned that over half of the human population is living in cities, expected to grow. Cities account for enormous amounts of world energy demand, carbon emissions. Importantly, they're economic powerhouses, contribute over 80% of global domestic product. There's now over 100 cities, multiple countries, individual states and businesses which have committed to net zero emissions. And then in terms of the work that I'm doing at Monash precincts specifically, we see those as an appropriate scale for accelerating these kinds of activities and the transitions to net zero cities. And I'll explain a bit later on why that's the case. So I mentioned, urban experimentation. It often takes place in what's known as urban living labs. And so these are sort of, social learning environments that generally bring together actors from, as I mentioned, universities, industry, government, the community, to really trial alternative technologies, social practices, new ways to govern, new policy innovations, new social innovations, and so on. And importantly, it's about designing, testing and learning in real world contexts. And what we're seeing over the last few years is universities themselves actually start to treat their campuses as living labs for sustainability. And universities can actually play a really important leading role in this shift towards sustainability and the shift towards net zero, because they have a lot of clout, they have a lot of prestige, they have a lot of knowledge, obviously. They have access to a lot of resources, technology that can be leveraged and demonstrated towards these kind of sustainable ends and so on. And so how that's taking shape in the context of Monash itself is the Net Zero Initiative. So you probably haven't heard of this. I'm not sure if it's come up in this class, but the Net Zero Initiative is something that Monash started about 4 years ago. We were the first university in Australia to set a carbon reduction goal to be net zero emissions by 2030. It's a $135 million program which is committed to introduce and to implement a variety of these changes at an infrastructure level across our 4 Australian campuses, really focusing on the main campus in Clayton, but the other campuses as well are going to move this way too. And what essentially, as you can see here, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening across, building facades, energy efficiency, installation of LEDs, the removal of gas appliances, electrifying the campus, putting some solar panels up, producing energy on site where we can, but we don't have the space for that. So we're actually also part of a consortium which is sourcing renewable energy through a power purchase agreement through a wind farm in regional Victoria. We have a microgrid which connects up about 20 or so of our buildings at the Clayton campus. And there's a large battery on one of our new buildings, which is part of that microgrid. And that enables us to run an example of a transactive energy market. So we can run a variety of experiments and actually treat the Clayton campus as a bit of a sandbox environment to understand what this transition to net zero can look like. And then we're also offsetting our emissions as well. So it's quite a comprehensive infrastructural program over the next decade. And what was missing, I suppose, from this was a research and education and translation component. So I worked with a team over the past year or so to actually put together what's known as an ARC linkage proposal, and we were fortunate enough to receive funding from the Australian Research Council for this project, which is about to start any day now. Actually, it's been a long time in the making, but we're actually about to kick off this research. So it's a 4-year program of work, and it's really centering on the you can see here that map. The Clayton campus is in the middle here, and there's obviously all these changes happening through the Net Zero initiative. But what we're keen to understand is how can we broaden and scale up these changes to the Monash Technology Precinct. So the Monash Technology Precinct is actually where Monash University is situated, and it's this broader area here, and it encompasses the Monash Health Precinct to the south. We've got CSIRO to the north. We've got the new Heart Hospital, which is going to be opening up, I think, next year on Blackburn Road down here. There's the Australian Synchrotron. There's a number of corporate head offices, including Bosch and Pfizer and I think ABA and a whole bunch of other corporates that are part of this technology precinct as well. So we're trying to understand how can we accelerate net zero transition at precinct scale, and what does it look like to actually bring a whole variety of partners together to understand how we can do that in a co-designed, co-creative, collaborative sense. So our main partner is Engie, which is a big French energy multinational, and they are also helping Monash deploy the Net Zero initiative through a range of technology and services and platforms as well. So they're going to be a key partner in this project. We've got local governments, including the city of Monash, involved. So we're going to be essentially treating the Clayton campus and the broader technology precinct as a living lab to bring these stakeholders together, including, Monash staff, Monash students, industry, government partners, to understand how we can undertake experiments in net zero energy, in net zero mobility, and net zero buildings, and then develop ideally a framework that can then be shared and hopefully replicated in other contexts, both in Australia but globally. And we've got ICLEI involved, which is a global network of local governments working towards sustainability. So we're working with their local office here in Melbourne, and they will share the learnings from this project with their global network of, I think they've got now a couple of thousand other local governments around the world who are working on various programs towards, shifting their communities towards sustainability. And the CSIRO actually as well, who are a key partner in this, they've got a network of living labs that they're setting up in Australia, starting in Sydney and Darwin and others around the country. So they're keen to understand how can we take these learnings from the net zero precincts work we're going to be doing here to then transfer some of those insights to other contexts. So what it looks like from a research point of view, and I won't spend too much time on this, is essentially bringing together transition management, which is a specific approach to transitions research, which is essentially a process-based approach where you set up like a living lab of what they call an urban arena, and then you work together with front runners, people who are motivated towards driving these kinds of changes, again, from that broad coalition of stakeholders, and then to come together with these staff, students, local government, industry partners, community members through this transition arena to actually envision what a net zero precinct could look like in the context of the Monash Technology Precinct, and then develop pathways to get there. And there won't be a singular pathway, there'll be multiple pathways, but the sense that the point of it is to really come together in a collaborative sense with the kind of key stakeholders to co-design that process. And then develop the experiments that I was talking about in energy, mobility and buildings. And critically, what we're doing here, we're working with colleagues at the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, Professor Sarah Pink, namely, and her team to bring design anthropology thinking and practice to this as well. So transition management can be seen as quite a systems-heavy approach, and so we're keen to bring in design anthropology and ethnographic thinking to really work very closely with the community and precinct and users, as it were, to make sure that we understand their lived experience of being in the precinct, moving around the precinct, and understanding what their visions and imagined futures for the precinct are as well. So that's what it's going to, essentially look like over the next 4 years. Just a very quick snapshot of the structure of the research. And then if you wanted to find out more about how it's kind of coming together, there's a paper that Rob Rabin and I recently co-authored in Urban Planning, and you can just follow that title there or link to read more about how we're starting to kind of unpack some of these challenges through these processes that we've identified around embedding, framing, governing and learning, which is very much coming at this from a, how do we understand urban planning through the lens of experimentation, and then how do we bring transitions thinking to understanding how to drive these kind of changes at a precinct scale, specifically using cases of urban living labs from around the world, and then sort of, shining a spotlight on what's happening specifically in the context of Monash through the Net Zero initiative. So if you want to, find out more about that, you can read through that. You can read that journal article a bit later on. What I wanted to shift to now, in the same vein, is really to, I suppose, just be a bit critical in terms of understanding that, we can view these kinds of approaches as a bit of a silver bullet to our problems, or a panacea, as it were. But I suppose it warrants, the concept of urban experimentation warrants greater critical reflection, just given the, complex interactions between different actors and institutions. There are competing visions, narratives and goals, even at the level of the Net Zero precinct. Not everyone is on the same page necessarily. And, so it's important to always, I suppose, think about the politics of experimentation in this sense, and how to, and just to be really reflective and aware of the, often the gap between, and the need to bridge, I suppose, top down and bottom up experimentation. So the bigger institutional actors will have a particular vision and approach that they want to push ahead with. And then, there's, often grassroots actors, community actors, it might be startups, others who, are coming at that more from a grassroots innovations perspective, and they will have quite different approaches to this. And then another aspect of this is around evaluation. How do you actually evaluate the outcomes of experiments to determine whether or not they've been successful? So these are sort of critical kinds of considerations. And the politics of all this is often, really something which should be front and center of, how you design those sort of interventions. We can sort of see some failed experiments, just to point to one here. If we think about the waterfront redevelopment in Toronto that Google was involved in through its subsidiary Sidewalk Labs, did anyone here or pick up on those debates as it was going on over the last few years? So there was a big public call to redevelop the Toronto waterfront, the sort of prime real estate in Toronto. Google won this multi-million-dollar, multi-year contract to build, and they eventually, promoted this vision of a kind of smart city, a city from the internet up, as they described it, which was full of sensors and surveillance and data extraction and data harvesting and so on. The kind of, standard sort of operating procedure for Google to sort of get as much data out of everyone as possible and monetize it, which is the kind of how their business operates. But there was a huge amount of community backlash. And so I suppose, and what eventually happened is the whole thing kind of fell over, and Google, sort of left Toronto with its tail between its legs, as it were. And it was sort of, a good example of how not to run these kind of, smart city projects when you have a very, very large, corporate entity coming in and sort of, dictating to the communities to how things were going to be, even though they did have, consultation sessions and workshops and come and speak to us and so on. It was clear that the overarching kind of vision for the project just did not generate the level of community buy-in and social license to operate to actually make it sustainable or actually feasible. And so it kind of lost momentum and had to kind of be unwound, as it were. So yeah, it's just important to recognise that it's critical to understand the needs of communities within which any kind of change intervention is embedded, and to be sensitive that you're not reinforcing existing power structures and modes of governance, which is much, much easier said than done. We saw a recent example as well in Melbourne with the Apple store, Apple wanting to open up a store at Federation Square, which led to a huge amount of community backlash. There was no consultation. It sort of came out of the state government, the planning office. It was like a unilateral decision to just, knock down a building at Fed Square. And there was a grassroots community campaign to overturn it, which lasted a couple of years, and they were actually successful, which was very impressive given that similar campaigns have fallen over in other cities around the world, and you've got these vast Apple stores in public squares in cities all over the place. So I think it was a rare exception in Melbourne where there was a huge amount of community mobilisation and engagement with the media and so on, and protests and other activities and interventions which made that project unsustainable as well. So this just brings me to the kind of second part, I suppose, of the lecture, which is more focused on the role of grassroots innovations and grassroots innovators in terms of the local sustainability initiatives that we see. So again, this is continuing on that same theme about transitions research, urban experimentation, but this is focused on how grassroots actors actually undertake these types of experiments. And this is related to an aspect of my doctoral research, where I helped set up and run a living lab in the city of Yarra called Live Well Yarra. So grassroots innovators, they're often people working in civil society, community groups, voluntary organisations, and they have a mix of social and sustainability motivations. You can see them everywhere if you just have a look. There's been a kind of outpouring of, for example, community gardens, urban agriculture, tool libraries, repair cafes. There's a whole, there's thousands of these initiatives all over the world. They often go under the radar, and unless you start looking for them, you don't really notice them. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There's lots of different examples of grassroots innovations all over the world. What we did in Yarra, we were working with grassroots innovators in the form of local community members, residents who are living in Yarra, who were really concerned about sustainability. And so this project, which was part of my PhD studies, were looking at, we actually set up an urban living lab in Yarra in the inner north of Melbourne, which worked with members of the local community. It involved Curtin University, the City of Yarra as the local government, Yarra Energy Foundation, which is a not-for-profit, and it was funded by the CRC for low carbon living. And so what that project did, essentially, we created a community group. So the founder, Rob Salter, he lived in the area, and there was a group that actually had set up like a community garden down the end of the laneway in their street, and they were very motivated and active and concerned about sustainability. And they, out of that, grew the Live Well Yarra kind of project. And essentially over a couple of years, we set up this living lab. And what it looked like was essentially a bunch of concerned citizens coming together. We set up a transition team that you can see there. We met about once a month at local libraries around Clifton Hill and Carlton and so on. And we worked to come up with a range of ways to actually engage and mobilise members of the local community. And so we had our launch back in 2015, and we ended up getting about 100 local residents to take part in this experiment. And what it looked like essentially was people coming together in these small group settings. We call them decarb groups. And they came together to kind of, share their, I suppose, angst around the state of the world and their shared, desire to want to, take action to make things better at a very local level. And so we gave them a whole variety of tools and provided them with resources to essentially empower them and to enable them to take actions towards reducing their carbon emissions at both a local, at an individual and a household and a community level. And so there are a range of different activities that went on over the course of the Living Lab. The group set up their own workshops. We had guest speakers coming in. We had experts talking about how to get to zero waste, how to start community gardens, get more involved in the sharing economy, how to get involved in divestment, how to put on solar panels on the roof in terms of group buying programs and so on and so forth. So all these kind of activities we describe as social learning, which are really key to the way Living Labs operate, and it's kind of a key objective of Living Labs is to sort of enable these sort of social learning environments to take place where groups of people can come together and then they can actually share their learnings in a peer-to-peer sense, and then hopefully have that scale out to broader members of the community. And so the way the way that I guess I was focusing on this in terms of my doctoral studies was through the notion of empowerment. So I was really interested in how can urban experimentation drive transformative change towards sustainability. And so then we, undertook this action research, actually working with members of the community. As a researcher, I wasn't sitting back in a passive sense with my clipboard, sort of like, observing, making notes. I was actively part of this group and helping set up the transition team, helping set up the small groups that met every month, bringing in the speakers and the engaging with local government, making it as welcoming and enticing and engaging as possible. And what ended up happening is, so over the course of these activities, the participants did end up making small scale changes in terms of draft proofing their houses, in terms of reducing their car use, getting involved in active transport, taking public transport, riding the bike, starting community gardens, getting involved in group purchasing of solar power and so on. So there were a whole bunch of sort of micro transformations, as it were, at a personal, household and community level, people switching over to green electricity retailers like PowerShop, for example. So there are a whole bunch of these small scale changes that we were able to observe over the course of the Living Labs activities. And one methodology I used to do that was something called asset-based community development, which is really about trying to work with existing strengths rather than looking at things through a deficit-based lens of what we don't have as a community. So we use this approach, asset-based community development, or ABCD, which has been used in a lot of different settings around the world. And it essentially starts from the, understanding of what gifts do people have. Like it could be, gifts of the head, like what knowledge they have. It could be a language. It could be about how to, get involved in marketing, communication, setting up a website. What gifts do they have of the hands? Like, do they know how to build things? And gifts of the heart, which are like, what are people really passionate about and how can they come together to mobilize change in their communities? So I used strength-based approaches like ABCD, like appreciative inquiry. I used participatory co-design, human-centered design to work with some of these groups who were starting projects to help them prototype some of these initiatives as well. So that was another aspect of the work from, I guess, a methodological point of view. And then I evaluated the outcomes of these experiments using something called most significant change. Because, as I mentioned earlier, evaluation is a very tricky part of this. If we're moving from, unsustainability towards sustainability, how do we measure before and after kind of impacts? And so I used this narrative-based tool called most significant change, which really is about asking people to disclose the direct impacts that they experienced from their own perspective, and to then foreground that through their personal experiences of, I switched to green power, I put solar on my roof. I stopped driving my car. I started walking to the shops more. So then you start developing these narratives of change that were impactful from the perspective of the participants themselves. So that was how I evaluated the outcomes of that particular project. And if you wanted to learn more, there's a neat sort of summary paper in sustainability where I go through the entire project and talk about this in terms of social learning, in terms of the empowerment outcomes, some of the tensions around leadership and ownership, and then the evaluation that went on as well. So you can either get in touch with me, or if you take note of that article title, you can just get access to that through the Monash library as well. To wrap up, because I know there's a real focus on how do we drive change, how do we think about these kinds of issues, bringing those problems and actors together as Craig framed it. And I want to stop talking so we can open up for a discussion, but there's just another final bit of work I wanted to talk about in the transitions field, which comes out of this emerging work in transformative social innovation. And it's through this notion of dynamics of transformation and capture. And what this work is doing is it's recognizing that community actors, grassroots actors, they'll often come together through new modes of doing, organising, framing and knowing. Doing is new technologies, practices. Organising is, groups that come together. It could be like Live Well Yarra, it could be a repair cafe that starts, it could be the group that, wanted to prevent Apple from opening a store at Fed Square. Framing those visions and narratives and so on that we talked about, images of the future. And then knowing is like new forms of knowledge, competencies, policy innovations, whatever it might be. So as civil society or grassroots community actors try and develop these narratives of change, and as they try and mobilize others to get involved in these projects, what invariably happens, as the transformative social innovation work has revealed, is that centers of power, what we mean by that is incumbents, often it's those in power, whether it's corporates, whether it's governments and others, they will try and prevent that change from happening. Or they will often, in fact, take concerted efforts to capture those initiatives and essentially take hold of those narratives and make them their own. They will repurpose those narratives and they will reframe them, as it were, to their own ends. And they will also use similar grassroots mobilisation tactics to prevent those kinds of changes from happening. To give you like a concrete example, I looked at activities that were happening in the sharing economy space. And I looked at a comparative analysis of a sharing economy group in San Francisco called the Sharing Cities Network, which is really a grassroots civil society-led movement which is supporting social justice, the urban commons, and so on. So the Sharing Cities Network started a number of years ago and developed this notion of sharing cities to try and counter some of the more top-down corporate activities of the corporate sharing space, led by actors including Uber and Airbnb and so on. So they developed this quite radical narrative around sharing cities. They mobilised a grassroots network of civil society actors from all around the world. And then what I did, I looked at how Airbnb actually undertook, in terms of, as those transformative changes were happening, Airbnb undertook various interventions to try and capture that movement by also developing their own sharing cities counter narrative, which was really more about, protecting people's livelihoods. Had much more of an economic kind of focus. It had a framing around freedom and liberty in the very much an American sense of, like open free markets and so on. And they then developed, as in Airbnb, then developed their own home sharing clubs, which were, on the surface, grassroots kind of clubs, which were actually funded by Airbnb to the tune of millions of dollars, which enabled Airbnb hosts, as in the people who rent out their homes and apartments and so on, to write to their elected representatives and to lobby on behalf of the platform to keep home sharing, as it were, free and open, and to prevent regulation of those environments from happening. So this is just an interesting study in, as transformative narratives come to the fore to try and push transitions into a certain direction, push society into a certain direction, you'll have incumbents who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo come along and use those same kinds of practices, those same modes of doing, organising, framing and knowing, and also mobilising grassroots actors, as it were, as well, to then prevent those changes from happening. So in the case of San Francisco, there was legislation that was put up to limit the amount of stays that could, short stay accommodation that could happen in that city. Airbnb spent millions of dollars, mobilised their host community, and eventually won that campaign and protected their interests essentially. And so that campaign got voted down to limit the amount of sharing that could take place. So this is an example of the politics of experimentation and just how tricky this work is for grassroots innovators to actually drive these kinds of transformations. If you wanted to read more, the article related to that research is in Urban Policy and Research for a special issue on disruptive urbanism that came out about 3 years ago. There's some really fabulous articles in there. And I can, point towards that. That's on the Monash Library as well. If you search the catalogue. And I'll stop talking. There's more links here. Happy to hand over to maybe Craig to facilitate a bit of a Q&A, ask if you've got questions, follow-up, feedback. I'll leave it open to you. So thanks for your time.
That's great, Darren. Can we put up a few emojis? And thanks. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I think that's the equivalent of like clapping on Zoom.
For sure.
Right. So this has been an interesting talk because it has introduced us to really bottom-up action. So our line of discovery, if you like, or our line of theory has been about these innovators or entrepreneurs popping up from, nowhere, acting outside the government and then attempting to sort of reach in and usually demonstrate something to the government or try and teach the government something through a government champion that helps the government with its ambition or helps the government stop doing something that it's doing wrong. So your example is the kind of the sister of this approach, I think, if I could say that, which is that a group of people coalesces from the community with a certain concern, and they did demonstrate another way of doing things, and they demonstrate this together, and they show that this practice is possible. And so I was going to say, you said at one stage when you were doing community gardens that you would involve local government, or that local government might attend some of your meetings. Do you think that was a way for local government to see what was going on and change its ambition based on your community projects?
I think in the case of Yarra, they were already leading on urban agriculture, and they were one of the first local governments in the country, I think, to have like a dedicated urban ag facilitator, which is a paid staff member. And then they actually set up subsequently, and it had I don't know. I mean, I think Live Well Yarra was probably part of that broader milieu in terms of like it contributed to that, acknowledgement that there was interest. But they set up a Connect, Share and Grow, I think it was called, initiative where you could undertake like a workshop to get trained up, meet your neighbours either side of you, and set up like a planter box garden or a verge garden or what have you. And council would actually give you resources and training as to how to manage and negotiate those relationships with your neighbours and so on. But there's a good example of like in Canberra, there's something called Lynham Commons, where a community group came together and over the course of a year or two negotiated the use of a parcel of land between a high school and a primary school and a bike path. It was like just an idle bit of land that the government owned, because in ACT there's only sort of like one level of government, as it were. There's no sort of local and state, it's the one kind of thing. And so they negotiated over a couple of years to get access to that little triangle of land to build an urban food forest. which was pretty impressive. And so they managed to get access to that site rent-free. It's not enclosed. Anyone can access the site. And so there's a community group that, can go there, and they've gardened, they've created a permaculture garden. They encourage others to come along and get involved and get engaged and so on. But it's hard work, and it takes a lot of volunteer hours, and it's not easy. But these projects definitely can both bring government along, but also government can be important in creating an enabling environment for these kinds of things to succeed.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Darren about his talk, or about aspects of bottom-up action or transitions, or anything else? It's quite a quiet group. I'll ask just one question. I realize actually we're over time, but I'll ask just one question about living labs. Mm-hmm. Everybody in this course is probably going to build a building that's going to have to meet some kind of energy performance standard. So if they're building a new building, especially in Australia, chances are the building is going to have to perform. And the most famous problem to do with this is the building energy gap, which is where the building has a certain expected performance in the design stage. And then when they build it and everybody moves in, the building doesn't perform. And I was going to ask you, Darren, what a living lab might contribute to solving this problem if you were able to put one together. So how would, as opposed to, looking at dials and gauges and technologies and door closing equipment and whatnot, how could a living lab take us closer to a solution to this, do you think?
I think it can actually demonstrate these solutions in situ, as it were, and bring together the end users of a particular, in that sense, like a set of innovations to actually understand how they interact with that space, where there is room for improvement. It sort of enables you to test and learn from innovations in a real world kind of context. It's not a theoretical exercise, and you've then got potential to engage with government partners to understand what policy blockages might be in place, or parts of the planning scheme or whatever that could prevent something or other from happening. And to really identify, I suppose, maybe those leverage points, and where there are often hidden barriers that aren't at first glance obvious. If you're working in a living lab setting, you've got access to community members to understand their needs, regulatory and policy people to understand how they can see this problem and maybe suggest pathways to overcome those barriers. And then you've got industry partners who can provide access and use of new technologies, which might be quite experimental and aren't quite ready for the market yet, and to be able to adapt those in collaboration with those other stakeholders. So that's the kind of benefits that a living lab can bring. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Yep. No, it does. It's good. It's one of the kind of tools that we will look at to cause policy change. All right. Does anyone have any other questions? I appreciate we're actually in the break time now, so we've run over a bit. But thanks again, Darren, very much for that. And it's great, as I said, to see transitions theory explained like this, and then to see it basically put to work at the community level, so at the urban local level, and to see it working. That's great. So I think if anyone comes forward with other questions, I can punt them over to you.
Yeah, and feel free to shoot me through. If anything's triggered your thinking and you want to have follow-up, just email me. I'm around and I can send you more resources and articles, and happy to do that.
All righty. Okay, that's cool. Thank you. And I think we'll go into a break. So it's 3:39 now. Let's come back at 3:50, about, because 10 minutes going to be enough. Yeah. Okay. So let's reconvene at 3:50. And thanks again, Darren. And great to have you on. Cheers.
Thanks for the invitation.
Alrighty.
Nice to be here. Take care, everyone. See ya.
See you at 3:50, everybody. All right. So let's pick up where we left off. We were looking at problems, and I'm happy to report that although we've looked at a lot of very different problems and you've shown me some examples, in the end, there's actually only 7 kinds of persistent wicked problems. Perhaps there's 8, or perhaps there's 5. It's a small number. And in my presentation here, I'm going for 7. And I'm going to show you each of them, and each one made up as an example of a problem in the built environment. The first one's one that you know, fixes that fail, because this was attached to your homework last week. Can you describe some examples for a given problem of where an attempt to fix the problem didn't fix it and actually made it worse? And I have a model for this here, and I've modeled traffic and roads. And the idea is that the increasing traffic calls for more roads. And when I play this and I answer the request for traffic with more roads, what happens is that the presence of more roads after a bit of a delay affects a sort of another benefit of roads. In this case, it's convenience. And so the more roads there are, the more convenient it is to use them. And you can see here that my attempt to deal with the original traffic has actually resulted in more traffic. So the fix, which is to build roads, fails and may even make the problem worse. The next one in this list of 7 that I've come up with, and that are called the 7 archetypes, is called shifting the burden. And the idea here is slightly different. There's an ideal solution we want to perform, but pressures or obstacles mean we have to just patch the symptoms. And in fact, that's all we ever do. We just patch it. And in this example here, in sharing the burden, it's another road example, but it's basically roads versus PT, which is public transport. And the idea is that we have a need to provide transport to build it. And it could go to roads, it could go to public transport, but in fact, public transport is the ultimate solution and roads are the patch. And so when we run this, you can see that we respond to the need to build transport like this. And initially we get roads and public transport. After a delay, we start to see the public transport being used up here. But also the building of roads causes the desire for roads to increase and the desire for public transport to decrease. And so after a while, you see this. Not an awful lot of public transport going on very much, but lots of roads. So the roads are the patch, if you like, the quick and easy one here in this tight loop. And public transport, the ultimate solution that we want, is just not getting built. The next one is called the limits to success. And what this problem describes is that we set a high goal, or we want our problem to keep succeeding. We want to keep solving the same problem, but we can't get there because of some other intervening variable. In this case, this little loop here would normally be a reinforcing loop. The more insulation we add to the building, the better the building performance. Okay, so that's a happy loop. But the reality is that there's a cost to provide a high performance building. And one of those costs is training. So if I was to just run this as if it were a loop as before, and I just ran it like this, even though there was a cost that affected building performance, you could see that the benefits of insulation cause the building performance to go up. So I can wind it forward in time. Costs go up, sure, but basically building performance remains high. If I play it, however, and I introduce some of these training costs, so we start this beneficial loop here, and it's successful, but that some of this kind of reality comes in from the outside. You can see that the additional cost introduced through training starts to impact building performance and insulation rates. And you can see that they drop right down. So this just shows that our success is not sustained. So the problem starts being solved, but it's not ultimately sustained. And number 4 is drifting goals. So in this example, we set a high standard to start with. So we have a high goal in mind. In this case, it is the designed performance of the building. We design a building to be highly performing. But then there's this issue of what happens in reality and the actual performance. We start off with a very efficient building in design, and it doesn't get realized as an efficient building. And that's due in part to costs, and it's due in part to the reality of building the building. We had initially had building codes here to push up the actual performance. So we start with high design performance. We push up the building codes so that the actual performance of the built form is as high as its design. And so we do this by starting with building codes. We pump it up like that, expecting to see the design performance stay high and the actual performance come up. And it does, but it doesn't stay up. And so let's see what happens in time when I crank it forward. It sets up this loop. So we don't end up with high performing buildings. We have something that is unreliable and goes up and down. And as the actual building performance goes down and this gap grows, the building codes themselves are made weaker, because the reality is you can't assert stringent building codes if you can't enforce them, and you can't enforce them if no one can build the buildings according to code. All right, number 5, success to the successful. So this is quite an easy one in some ways. And what it illustrates is that if there are limited resources and they're given to the dominant player, then the dominant player wins. And the way I've implemented this is I've got basically concrete versus bamboo. And there are resources needed for bamboo and there are resources needed for concrete. And there's this thing in the middle here, which I'm calling the want for concrete, the incumbent demand for concrete. And so when I play this and there's a demand for concrete, what you see is that it erodes the demand for bamboo. So bamboo's our ideal solution, but concrete wins. And the opposite's true as well. It's just that I've labeled it this way. So for example, if there's a call for bamboo, a demand, it gets the resources and concrete gets none. So it's just a nice, simple diagram showing mutual exclusion. One side wins because the other side loses. These problems are super common. Okay, this one is a very common one, the escalation problem. So in escalation, 2 people are competing and their performance drops because they have to make compromises in order to stay in the competition. In this case, I've implemented as two builders. So there's a builder A and a builder B, and there's poor quality apartments being constructed. And so builder B, because of the competition, makes price cuts. This leads to more low quality buildings. But when builder B does this, the lower prices cause builder A also to drop their standards. So we'll start the game with some price cuts, and this increases the rate of crappy flats. And in order to compete over limited market share, builder A and builder B both end up building crappy flats. Sort of the opposite of escalation, if you like. The final one I've got in this 7 is called Tragedy of the Commons. This is a bit more complicated. What it is that, and you can't see, it's slightly cut off here. It says A gains at the top of the screen, and the bottom here it says B gains. It's about two builders, builder A and builder B, and there's a limited wood supply. And in an ideal world where people could share, you would see equal amounts of building going on here because they shared. But Tragedy of the Commons causes or is modeled when one builder takes all the wood and uses up the wood supply, so there's none for the other. So we start off by pumping the wood supply, and initially we get some building and gains for B and A. And as the wood supply waxes and wanes, you can start to see that there's no building activity. Neither builds. And when any building activity happens, one grabs all the wood, and so the other one doesn't get to build. In a properly shared commons environment, it would be designed so that everybody could keep building and the wood supply would never be fully depleted. All right, those are the 7 problems. So in the problems you've looked at so far in your homework, there will be one of these, possibly more than one of these, in each of your problems. All of these really difficult, wicked, complex situations can usually be reduced to one or more of these. And as I said, I asked you to find some fixes that fail, or fixes that fail that you imagined for the problem. And so right away, you can see there's one of those in there. In order to work out which one of the loops might apply to your problem, there are some questions to ask. We already know about fixes to fail, but what about shifting the burden? In the persistent problem you've analysed, have there been attempts to solve the problem that have basically got stuck as the reoccurring suboptimal solution? Meaning, does the problem look like it has a distant solution, but they just can't get there? They just can't get there. They're stuck applying a patch and just dealing with the symptoms. Okay, this is a shifting the burden. You would then take the loopy network for this and relabel it to illustrate your problem. Is there a program, a problem where things are just getting worse? Or a solution which used to work is diminishing? So your persistent problem is some issue in a country like healthcare, crime, or homelessness. They had it under control once, but it's going downhill. And people's expectations for a solution are also dropping. Or the problem is just being welcomed and accepted and tolerated. That's why it's not being solved. Is that what's going on? In which case it's this limits to success. Drifting goals, again, are things collapsing? And are goals mutually exclusive? Are there 2 goals? And trying to meet one of them erodes the other goal. We can't have both of these ideals at once. And you saw with success to the successful, is it the case that one of the parties gets all of the resources. So does all the new building and construction go to concrete based builders? And no one asks any questions. They don't know about bamboo, so they just hand over all building projects to conventional builders, no questions asked. And thus you have a high energy, high emissions built environment. In this case, for escalation, is there some sort of competition? Does one proposed solution see another solution as a threat? Is it conflict that's wrecking the final good outcome of solving the problem? And then, as before with Tragedy of the Commons, if any of the players have free and open access to the resource, they'll tend to take it all. So is the situation there where some scarce resource, whether it's wood or energy or fuel or land, are there players or parties that you can just go and grab it all? And this is locking in unemployment or poverty. Is this the problem? So there's sort of 7 questions you can ask that go with it. Why would you go to the effort of explaining something as a loop? It's to help you interact with the people who have the power to actually solve the problem. So you come forward with your solution. First of all, you diagram the problem in a nice, simple way. And then you can actually show them that this infinite loop here can be broken. So as before with the traffic problem, the construction of more roads has led initially to less traffic, but because of increased convenience, to more traffic. So let's break the loop. All right, let's create a congestion charge. And we'll just have it sitting here. And every now and then, we'll fire the charge, which will diminish the traffic. Okay, so let's do that. Build some roads, traffic goes down, traffic comes up, getting ready to fire the charge. There we go. Okay, and this removes the traffic kind of briefly, right? So just sort of responding, if you like, and trying to whack them all on the head as it appears, but it's just not sustainable, right? The traffic keeps coming back. No matter what I do, no matter what the charges are, eventually the traffic will return. I'll show you this by cranking it up. All right, well, it looks like I bankrupted everybody. So a better solution would be something that's self-regulating. So let's have a charge that's levied. Let's increase it with a second negative feedback loop. And let's have the traffic itself cause the charge. Okay, so as the traffic gets bad, it's going to fire up charges. The more people who use the roads, the more they're going to pay. Okay, so as before, I kick off some roads, less traffic, more charge, less traffic, more charge. Okay, and so you set up this situation where the charges fire whenever the traffic gets bad. Wind it forward. All right, looks like we're getting more roads and more traffic. Let me try that again. So what I'll do is I'll actually increase the charge and I'll start that off. So we've got traffic and then we get more charges and less traffic. Okay, this is more like it. All right, so lots of charges and then it's keeping traffic under control. Lots of roads getting built as well. All right, this is one way to do it. Another way to do it would be to do something with the convenience. So we can charge people for driving, but they may still drive and accept the charges. It just costs more to drive because it's so convenient. So another solution might be to actually diminish this or add a cost for the convenience. That kind of hack. So there's one way to break it with a charge. Another way to break it with a self-regulating charge. Again, it's not a complete solution. But Loopy lets you muck around and add extra nodes on to attempt to break that loop. Let's go to one that we've seen before. This is the Malaysian sustainable building situation. And as we explored, it has 6 separate things that are going on that are a problem. And I've modeled it in Loopy like this. So basically there's no knowledge, no benefits, no market, no product, no regulation, no practice. And these things are basically all keeping each other down. I'll just show you here what that looks like in Loopy. Okay. So if the market continues to be bad and nothing changes, you can see here that this loop will go forever and nothing will change. What's needed is a piece of innovation. So we need an entrepreneur to come in, a front runner, and for them to introduce something from outside to break the loop. And in this case, it's going to be a demonstration or an experiment. And the way that works is that we're going to demonstrate the benefits of sustainable buildings. And by doing that, we're going to actually introduce some value into this loop. So the demonstration provides tangible benefits, which then stimulate the market, stimulate products, and so forth, which turns this non-circle or a circle of zero into a kind of a virtuous cycle of improvement. And all we really did over here was just execute a demonstration that showed the benefits. There's the hack. This is a hack. Simple solution to a problem that's nice and simply illustrated. I could have introduced that little ball here. I could have introduced it anywhere. Okay. I could have put it down here and stimulated the markets by providing subsidies for sustainable buildings. Could have made some products, could have started with some kind of new regulation about building performance and so forth. Anything to break this loop. Now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to visit the Nexial built environment map. It's at this address. This is a very elaborate tool. And I want you to go and watch the introductory video. So when you click this link, you can go to watch Government and Policy, which is a short video. And then if you go explore the map and you look at government and policy and you look at roles, you can look at the role of policy making. All right, did you get a look at that? So Georgia, what is this? What do you think this gets used for?
I don't know, do entrepreneurs use this as like a way to figure out where they can potentially intervene or who they can work with? Maybe,
not this particular tool. This tool doesn't really show off problems or gaps or places to break in. Does anyone else want to have a guess what this would be used for? This costs a fortune, this tool. It was built by the Nexial people, funded by the Laudes Foundation, which is a charitable arm of the global clothing empire. Anyone else want to have a guess what this thing is for? What about you, Georgius? I haven't heard from you today. Did you have a go at this?
Probably to know about the how the built environment works, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, is this talking about a specific country?
Probably discussing about the country in Europe, maybe, because I found that some of them are based on Europe policy. I think maybe not really sure.
Yeah, it's not based on any one country. It's what I would call an idealized model. So it's attempting to tell a general story, which should be true in a lot of places. Does anyone else want to guess why you would make something like this? Kate, do you want to have a guess? Why would someone make a thing like this? Are you there? Kate must have popped out. I think you're muted. What about you, Lei? Do you want to have a go at this?
So you mean for this diagram?
Or just what do you think this is used for? Like why would someone go to such a elaborate drawing and animating effort for something like this? Can you think of why you would have something like this? Why it would be made?
So this is more like a structure for the how can I say?
It's the whole thing is about the built environment. So the whole system map that they've made is only about the built environment, and its purpose is to attempt to explain everything to do with built environment pollution everywhere. And in that way, it's kind of a bit risky because it's obviously a very Western model. It's obviously it's all in English, and it's making assumptions about how the government works. So here's one of their diagrams about how the government works. But what this is for, what the whole purpose of this tool is to get these people in the room, right? To get the banks in the room, okay? And other people in this stream here. This is the finance stream. And to show them how they're responsible for pollution. They play a role in supporting building. And this system shows them how they are contributing to the problem, and then how to solve that problem. And so here on this view, they've got a whole model dedicated to barriers. And you might look at this and you can start to see it kind of looks a bit like loopy, doesn't it? They've put all sorts of things on there, like, I don't know if you can see this, it's a bit low res, but it says lack of political will, short-term thinking, okay? These are the things that are the barriers to the government solving these emissions problems in built environment. And you would use this tool here in the same way that we use Loopy to make a point about the stuckness of the problem, the persistence of the problem. And then hopefully you can use the tool you've chosen to show that injecting some kind of influence right here breaks whatever the loop is. A bit later on in this course, I'm going to hand it over to you to build a toolkit with all the things I've shown you to equip other people to solve your problem that you've identified. You can choose one of the problems that you've chosen in your pairs, or you can go get a fresh one, or you can refine the problem. I'm going to try and help you refine the problem this week. But one of the main outputs of this course is your toolkit to arm a group of people to solve the problem. And so this tool, the Nexial map, might be one of the things that you use. You might be like, well, my problem has got to do with building emissions, or my problem's got to do with bad investments in buildings. And the Nexial tool illustrates that in a real nice way. And so this might be one of the things in the toolkit that you would say, you've got to take this thing to the government and show them this, and show them the part that they play in the solution. Or, depending on the problem, maybe Loopy is enough. Okay, so if you've picked a problem that you can do a faithful job in Loopy, and you can even get it to run and show how the dynamics work, this is the tool that you would put in the toolbox. You'd say, you got to take this tool that I've made for you, to take it to these kind of people in the government, we'll work them out, these kind of people. You've got to show them this tool, you've got to use this narrative. This is what you are going to make in the last 4 sessions of this course. And I'm going to run a boot camp to teach you how to do this, and then how to actually pitch your toolkit. And you'll do that in front of a set of judges who are policy people and experts. That's where we're going with this. Sounds crazy, I know. But the thing you produce is the sort of thing that we will then popularize through our research. So we are performing parallel research in this vein. These kind of toolkits, specially formed for specific problems, are the things that are missing. You guys are going to have a go at making them, and I'll coach you through the whole thing. All right. So you've got a way to pull problems apart. You've got some illustration tools. You need to, once again, think about who the right person for the job is. And remember how I pulled this up a few weeks ago? You should now be able to look at the entrepreneur that you filled the form in for. You should be able to look at that man or woman and be able to say, I think this person mostly does what they do through marketing. They just have a marketing gift. They create new products and the government adopts them. I don't know. And it should be possible to get a kind of description of the kind of team player that they are. And so how well do you know them? You filled out a form, you've answered 100 questions about them. Can you describe them with any of these traits if you were asked to pick a couple of these entrepreneurs? So I'm going to share these forms among all of you that everyone has filled out. And I want you to pick the people that can solve your problem. You can just have a guess. But I also want you to explain why you picked that person. So you've got a problem to do with inequality and you choose Jan Gale, although I don't think we've covered him. If you choose Jan Gale, you chose him because he's someone who's into people, he's into cities for people, he's into providing free open spaces for people, don't cost anything, blah, blah, blah. So this is what you'll put together. And just these high-level classifications might help you pick the right person. And again, you could also apply this. So as you work your way through the list of entrepreneurs, the potential team members, you might decide that your problem needs a front runner, someone who can come in and say, look, you got to do something completely new here. And in our loopy loops, the congestion charge is something a front runner would put in there. It's completely new. Here's your traffic diagram, everything's stuck. Put this whole new thing in there. And the same goes for the Malaysian problem. You've got a stuck loop in Malaysia. You need a whole new practice introduced. You need a front runner to do that. Or you need someone who can create new connections. And remember that a connection within Loopy is really a connection between groups of people in the end. And how do they interact or they don't interact, or how they impact each other, the connector solves that. And then as before, I covered topplers and supporters. Maybe this is the classification you'll use with the entrepreneurs. And then finally, there's this one. So this is yet another way to look at entrepreneurs and decide what kind of people they are. And this is the sort of human one, the personality one. And given the kind of problems that you've got, do you need a really agreeable person? Because in your stuck situation, there's two aggressive parties working against each other. Two parties that won't talk. Do you need someone who has the ability to get them to talk? So this is another taxonomy. These things are taxonomies. These are how you describe the players. And then you bring them to your problem. And then finally, there's these kind of hacks. So we'll go more into these hacks. I showed you a couple of real simple ones. I showed you how a congestion charge works here, how an experiment works there. These are hacks. They break loops. What could you do to guarantee the future of bamboo in the example I showed you? Okay, in my example with bamboo, all the work goes to the concrete guys. What could you do to that loop to make sure that bamboo can come from behind and win? Okay, what extra connections are needed? And in this example here, there's the hack of new connections among existing people. For example, in India right now, they're implementing a building code. So India has no energy performance building codes at all, and they're implementing one. And the local government's saying, we can't handle this. We can't learn this stuff. It's too hard. This stuff with building performance, we're just public servants, so you can't do it. And so the new connection in India that's working is to connect architects to local government and actually have architects hired into the local government solely to look at building performance applications. That's the hack. So without the architects working in the government, you've just got all these public servants saying, I can't do this, it's too hard. And so that's another kind of hack. This is the one that Gail used. He looked at Piazza in Italy and he brought them to Melbourne. So this is the update, transform, relocate. I showed you an example a few times ago to do with poverty, where elite people decide the poverty solutions, and this causes the poverty to get worse or stay the same. The obstacle is a belief that only educated elite people can decide what's best for poor people, is an obstacle that has to be removed. It's a hack. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with this one. We're almost done. What new story can be made and illustrated with something like Loopy or something like Nexial or one of hundreds of other tools out there, what new story can be created which describes the problem in a new way that makes it sound easier to solve? And I've got a couple of easy ones to end with. Read the top thing and read the bottom thing. So what's going on in these two stories? What's going on in the top story? Is the top story gonna convince anybody of anything? Do you think it's true? Do you think the top story is true? I'll ask someone else. Shirley, have you read these two stories? And if you're a politician, would the top story really change your mind?
Yeah, I think because I know the visa, like the immigration visa, like I know there's working visa that you can turn into a permanent resident, but you have to find an employee or to hire you and get a.
But it's, unless, if someone said this to you, what the government can't do anything, right? The more people we let in, the more unemployment there'd be. You'd need to see the numbers because it's actually not true. But it's an example of one of those nasty sort of sounding stories that really is like a racist story almost, saying that the reason that we have unemployment in Australia is due to migration, right? And that's not the case. The reason we have unemployment in Australia is due to much larger forces outside this country. It's due to skills and access to training. It's due to regional changes. It's due to internal migration. There's a lot of reasons. And so in order to get the government to solve this, in order to try and open up a nice discussion, we can't just shout at them that they can't do anything right, right? So that's -5 points for being starting a fight. But secondly, it's important to tell a different story. So the second story, the one at the bottom of the screen, says what the real problem is. The real problem is bigger than Australia. It's got to do with the international market and trade, iron ore, purchasing, steel, blah, blah, blah. These are international forces. And then it actually says what the solution is. It offers a solution. And it actually says that if the government can stimulate wage growth somehow, it gives workers more money, who spend more money on the economy, who get themselves retrained. The government gets more tax, and people have more money. So it's addressing the problem, and it's also starting a story, a new story, not a racist story, a story about improvement. So this is an example of how to craft these narratives, and I'm going to teach you how to do this. So the one at the top, I understand why you recognize that one, right? You get on the news and there's interviews on the news. Everyone is saying something is wrong with the government, right? The vaccine rollout, it's Morrison's fault. But just telling the government that it's the government's fault is not going to fix anything. I got a couple more examples. So just have a quick read of these and see if you can start to see where I'm going with this. All right, so what's the difference between these two narratives? If you can see a difference.
It's talking about.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Okay. It's talking about outsourcing and exporting our work instead of letting people in, kind of letting people go and whatnot. And then it provides the reasoning behind this, because we reduced by 26% our emissions in the NDC. So it kind of justifies it all, and it poses, this question, and then brings the solution and the reason behind it as well.
Yep, that's right. So just imagine two different people speaking. One person is the top person, shouting through a megaphone.
Yeah.
You silly government, you've cost us the car industry. And then a different person, who I know you can see is the policy entrepreneur, comes in with a new narrative. And in the top story, it's not true, right? Australia didn't lose its car industry because of the government. It's sad we had a car industry, but we lost our car industry again due to global forces. It's just cheaper and better to make cars outside this country. It's very sad, but that's what it is. And it wasn't the government's fault. And you can see, in fact, if the government had supported the car industry, it still would have collapsed. We would have poured money into it and it would have still collapsed. So the second story uses statistics, or it uses facts. So Australia made a commitment to its to the Sustainable Development Goals. It said it would reduce its emissions. This is a fact. And greening the steel industry is a real thing that we really can do. And then the story even ends with a kind of a nationalistic slogan, we've got the iron ore and the solar power to do this, blah, blah, blah. We can be the best again, Australia, blah, 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 blah. So depending who you're talking to, the narrative might need this ambition in it. You'll create a story that has ambition. And this is the last one, and I've used Jan Gehl. So just imagine two different people are speaking here, trying to get Times Square decard, and compare the top story to the bottom story. All right, so what kind of mind control am I using here? What's going on in the first narrative, in the top one?
Can I try?
Sure. Go, Jeremy.
Yeah, like in the first one, it kind of shows like that the current situation and how the problem is, and what the city is facing. But the reasoning below, like the second one, seems to be coming from a very personal opinion and not a database claim, which then kind of creates like a biasness. And I guess throughout all the campaigns that we've seen, it kind of, I guess, like is a comparison to what we see, like what Trump says about certain things without any data, and versus like someone who claims certain things, but then like has data to back it up and whatnot.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the top one is full of statistics, right? And they look true. I mean, they're what Jan Gale uses. But the problem is that the top one is just all statistics. That's all it is. And in the end, it just says, well, you know, if you got rid of those cars, everyone would get 17 extra days of life, blah, blah, blah. Pretty crazy statistic, isn't it? But the second one is, as you said, Jeremy, it's a personal appeal. So it's a story that takes the position of the driver. Like everyone thinks, oh, the drivers are bad. Stupid cars, get rid of them. But it actually takes the position of the driver and says what they're missing out on, right? So this is a new narrative, a new story coming in from a new angle. And it gives us a new statistic. You know, 10 cars have on average 15 people in them, right? 6 out of every 10 cars has one person in it on the roads. 60% of all cars have just the driver. And the others might have 2 or 3, so 15. But those 10 cars take up this enormous space for 100 cafe. So it's just a random example I made up with facts. But my point is that this narrative, this driving story, is the thing that has to be sculpted right. And then you back this up with your tools, your loopy diagram, you back this up with your killer statistics, your examples in the real world, and so on. But this is kind of almost the easiest part of this business. All right. And I'm just going to finish here by saying that the kit that you'll make will include a narrative as its pitch. And you'll have crafted a narrative for the problem that you've chosen, a promising new narrative, and you'll be giving this narrative to the people who are going to go solve the problem. And yeah, I'll be developing this one a bit further. So I'll tell you what I'd like to do next. It's as I said before, I'd very much like to feedback on the problems that you put on Mural. Okay, I think you've done a great job. Very hard problem. The problems are a problem, but I think you've done a good job picking them apart. Next week, I'll get some of you to explain more of them. I only got to hear about 3 of them today. But I'll feedback on the network diagram in the description and the loopy. And I'm also going to reshare your Moodle submissions that are the forms. Okay, so both those things are due today. I hope everyone got a shot. I think there were just 2 teams missing from Mural. Put them on there, please. And tonight or first thing in the morning, I'll have feedback. I'll have reshared the Moodle. And then what I want you to do is try and just justify picking which entrepreneurs can solve your problem. So look at the entrepreneurs, look at the tools they use, look at what they do. Look at your problem as you understand it, and I'll feedback a bit to help you. And then I want you to try and make this dream team and justify it in Mural on the week 5 space. I'd also like you to try and visit your loopy loops to see if you can pull out one of these classic 7. Some of you may have already used one of the 7, like in fixes that fail. And then if you can break the loop. So if you can get a really small toy version of your problem running, and you can introduce something that breaks it or connect it in a new way that breaks it, this would be good. And yes, just use Mural. And you'll be basically copying people and copying problems over to week 5, but I'll help you update your problem a bit with some feedback.
With the question 4, down to 1 of the 7, what do you mean by that again? Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So the 7 kinds of problems are called the 7 archetypes. I just call them, there's only 7 problems.
Yeah.
And that's like fixes that fail, eroding goals.
Okay. Yeah.
Tragedy of the commons, etc. Can you identify one of those in your problem?
Yeah.
It's very likely that you can. In fact, it's like 100% likely. Because usually one of those stuck problems is behind this or part of it. So that's it. So anyone got any questions, or any of this not clear or too hard or too easy? Let me know. No one's going to say if it's too easy. If it's easy, I'm glad. Okay, so try and get the last of your mural people onto the mural. I've got one team to deal with who have got a very brief extension, and I'll check out mural and start feeding back tonight and tomorrow and hand back the Moodle submissions.
Craig, will you just write comments on mural on the
If I can. So if it's been pasted on there as a PDF, and if I can get a comment on there if there's room, I will. Otherwise, I might just mail one of the group members.
I think you can add sticky notes onto
It's had
Moodle.
sticky notes, yeah.
All right. If I don't make a complete mess of it, that's what I'll do.
Cool.
Yeah, no worries.
All righty. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Craig.
Get stuck, let me know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.